this idea that America may no longer be the global oil currency, Robert Fisk's report that major oil producers plan to ditch the dollar. Well, Saudi Arabia, Oman and Kuwait, they've all come out and said, no, don't know anything about this. And they're not the only countries to do so. Japan's finance minister was adamant that he had no idea of the plan either.
I know absolutely nothing about it, nothing at all. I guess reports like that come out once in a while, but I know absolutely nothing about it.
OK, let's talk to Stephen King, the HSBC economist. Let's talk to Robert Fisk, too, the author of that report in The Independent, about the Gulf countries, Japan, Russia, China, all thinking of getting rid of the dollar. Robert, let me ask you about that first. This is not a new idea. They've talked about doing this for some time, and the danger, of course, is that if any word comes out about it, as it has done in your article, then, of course, the dollar's woes are going to increase. But tell me why you think they're talking about it now.
Well, they've been talking about it for 2 years, and there have been at least 4 meetings in comparative secrecy to discuss this as a project which would be completed, that's to say the non-dollarization of the oil market, by 2018. But you're quite right, there's a background to this in which we've had various world leaders, Sarkozy of France, Medvedev, Putin, the Chinese Prime Minister, all expressing over the past few months their concern that we need a new international financial system and a tendency to move away from the dollar. So this has been on the cards for a long time. What we now know is it is a project, and both in Hong Kong and from the Gulf and here in Beirut, I've managed to again and again come up with the same information coming out across the board. Yes, the Saudis have been involved. Yes, the Gulf Cooperation Council are involved, though they are planning, I'm told, a new currency. But again, we're talking 9 years ahead from here. This is still in its infancy.
Yeah, and even if they are planning a new currency, there are arguments about where the central bank for that's going to be. Robert, come back to you in just a moment to talk about what the implications of this might be. But let's bring in Stephen King from HSBC, current at the IMF World Bank meeting in Istanbul. Now, we're talking about a new world order financially and the way that it's actually going to be set up. I don't think anybody doubts that China, India, the Asian markets are going to have a very strong say. But how small a say do you think the USA might have?
I think the US is still very important. To suggest it's going to sort of demise all of a sudden is just not realistic. What I think is important, perhaps from a dollar perspective, is that it is clear, as Robert says in his comments, that there is some frustration with the dollar as the world's reserve currency. I'm not sure that the creation of a new currency in the Middle East or elsewhere is going to change that role particularly, because after all, we've had the creation of the euro, and it's still the case that the dollar is the world's reserve currency. But over a 10, 20, 30-year period, one could imagine other currencies beginning to jostle for position, partly because there is a frustration with the US being the center of attention, and with the possible, if you like, asymmetry of the US setting monetary policy for itself, but having a huge impact on countries elsewhere in the world. The euro is a big part of this story in terms of the rise of competing reserve currencies. But the other one I would really mention as a possibility for the next 20 or 30 years would be the Chinese renminbi yuan, because that's the one that's really going to be important, I think, from an Asian perspective over the years ahead.
Stephen, you wrote a couple of weeks ago, the bad news is there could be years of disappointments when it comes to people recovering the wealth that they've lost, or indeed being able to make new wealth. And yet we were looking there at the growth of the economies in countries like Brazil, Russia, China, India. Is it going to be the ordinary citizen now who takes the hit rather than the central banks and the big companies?
No, I think that what we're going to see is a situation in the Western world which will be heavily constrained by all the huge debts that have been built up over the last few years. Not just household debt, but also government debt as well. Both of these are really big problems that will lead to, I think, an age of austerity. And that age of austerity will imply that growth in the States and Europe will be pretty weak. But for other parts of the world, and this is something that's reflected in our Emerging Markets Index that's been published today at HSBC, there's clearly signs of recovery. And the key difference is that in China, in India and other countries, they haven't had the same kind of banking crisis. They haven't got the same debt problems. They've got lots of productivity growth coming through currently, and consequently, they're going to carry on growing. And the evidence does suggest that in terms of who is leading the world out of this recession, it's actually the emerging nations and not so much the US or Europe. In the old days, we used to think that whatever happened in the US would actually absolutely dominate the rest of the world, but the US is a shrinking force, and what we're now beginning to see is the world economy being driven by China, by India and by others.
Robert Fisk in Beirut. sideline, I thought I saw you looking a little bit worried when you heard a low-flying aircraft, but I think it was actually in Istanbul rather than behind you. But
no, I think I lost my sound for a second.
Okay, all right. I saw you looking a bit scared. If we look at the possibility that China might rise as a major power, and its oil needs are enormous, the US still has enormous oil needs. You have these two great big beasts either side of the biggest oil-producing region in the world, which is the Middle East. What's going to happen?
Well, you see, I think the great danger is that, first of all, I should point out that China has about $2.3 trillion worth of reserves, of which 70% are in dollars. So you can see the Chinese perspective is they want to be free of this and pull up their own currency. But I think the real problem here is that if we're going to have an economic battle fought over the Middle East, not over the justices and injustices of the conflicts in the Middle East, but about oil, then we're not going to solve the problems of the Middle East. We're going to find that the Middle East once again becomes a tool of superpower rivalry rather than issues upon which the world should cooperate in order to solve everything from Kashmir to Palestine to the whole Iraqi-Afghan situation. We're going to be distracted yet again away from the politics and have to concentrate on the superpower rivalry, which in the past was Soviet Union and the United States, and now is going to be, as you rightly point out, I think, and as our colleague in Istanbul said, it's going to be America and China.
Yep, the fulcrum will be the Middle East. I don't think a lot of people would disagree with that. Stephen King?
I fear so.
Yeah, coming back to you, you're there because of the IMF meeting. The IMF has come in for a lot of criticism because of the way that it's run, and the problems, rather than the answers, the problems that is presented to countries to whom it has lent money. Do you see that changing?
Well, I think what is beginning to change is that the IMF is beginning to wake up to the realities of the present-day global economy. It was designed after World War II. The obvious countries were as part of the design, and it was designed to create, if you like, a harmonious financial system which was associated with so-called Bretton Woods. And that was fine for many, many years until Bretton Woods itself broke down and things went awry. Thereafter, the IMF, I think, has struggled for a role because, for the simple reason that the global economy itself has changed a long way. And to take the emerging markets in total, emerging nations in total, they're about the same size in terms of global GDP as the US. They need to have a say. They haven't had a say in the past, but that is now beginning to change. Now, whether that leads to a harmonious situation or, as Robert Fisk describes, a sort of a superpower rivalry between China and the US is difficult to say at this stage. But nevertheless, I think the IMF is waking up to the realities of how the global economy is now looking.
Quick thought from you, Robert, before we leave this subject. We heard there from Japan's finance minister say, no, the man writes rubbish. We've heard from Oman, Saudi Arabia, all of them saying Mr. Fisk must be off his trolley. Does that make you believe it's even more true?
Yes, and for another reason is a very prominent Chinese banker in Hong Kong said to me last week, what you've got is a true story, and you will know it because of the thunder of denials. And I was quite delighted to see how thunderous they were.
Thanks very much. Thanks, Robert Fisk,
You're
Stephen King. Good to have your views.